Hey everyone, it's Mojaxx back in the DJ City UK lab. Today I'm reviewing the Kontrol D2 from Native Instruments. Now, I've actually had a Kontrol S8 review unit for quite some time, but I've not had an opportunity to do a video review. So you'll be able to apply a lot of my thoughts about the D2 onto the S8, because effectively the D2 is the deck section of an S8, just chopped off and put into an individual unit. So a lot of what I'm going to say will apply to both, and it will be kind of instructive to have this S8 here as we go through the review. It's an interesting product. It is what Native Instruments call a next generation deck. This is designed to be your deck moving forward, and that might not work for some people, but it might work for others in a really good way. So let's start by looking at the hardware itself. Native Instruments have crammed a lot into the D2. You've got full track browsing, you've got control over one track deck and a remix deck, or two track decks. We'll get onto that a bit later in a bit more detail. But yeah, you've got your pads there for your cue points, your loops, etc. You can set and delete them from the unit, and they're the typical Native Instruments pads. So they're kind of clicky sort of pads. They're not really soft, but they do have a really nice positive action to them. You've got touch sensitive knobs up at the top, so you can select your effects and then have full control over every parameter on two different effects units on the actual device itself. You can adjust the BPM, so although there's no pitch fader, you've got fine control over the BPM down there, and if you hold shift you've got more wide control of the BPM as well. Plus you can adjust the key from there as well. You can zoom in and zoom out on the waveforms. All that kind of stuff is all present and correct. One thing to bear in mind is you will need an audio interface to use with these, whether that's going to be within your mixer or an external one like an Audio 10 or something like that. You're going to need audio for this. They are really just controllers from that point of view. When you've got a remix deck loaded, obviously all the other controls come into play, those faders and so on, and those will also be functional with the stems when they come through. Now, stems aren't currently ready for the D2 or Traktor 2.8, and I'll be taking a closer look at those when they come along at a later stage. You shift between decks, you've got your touch strip down at the bottom, so instead of your platter, and that's great for pitch bend, and you can see it's got really nice kind of momentum to it when you actually pause the deck and you want to search through. Feels really nice to use. You've also got the looping there. The main looping control is done on the knob on the side. You can change the length, and obviously you can see it on the screen, which is nice to do. You can hold shift and skip through the track with that as well. Plus you've also got the auto loop buttons, so they can do whatever measure you want. You set that in the preferences within Traktor. You can do long ones or short ones. Ideal if you put it into flux mode, you can do loop rolls. Then you've got the beat jumping as well on the bottom half there, just below. So you can skip through the track that way as well. And again, you can set the increments that will jump in the preferences in Traktor. You've then got the freeze mode, which is a bit like Serato's slicer mode. So you can chop up a loop quite happily there. And then you can also have, if you've got a track deck playing, you can also have your remix slots active. So you can see this thing is very much geared towards remix deck users. The actual hardware itself is the typical Native Instruments plastic body, metal fascia and so on. It all feels really sturdy. I've had no hardware problems with any of my Native Instruments hardware up to now. It's all just taking a beating. You will want to look after this a little bit more because of course you've got that screen in there and you'd be pretty heartbroken to break that. On the back, you've got a USB hub, which is a nice little touch. You get two extra USB ports. You will require power for this, and they come with a splitter cable. So if you've got two of them, you can actually just run them off the one power outlet. And again, that's a really nice touch, a nice bit of engineering. The flexibility is one of the things that I got a problem with this, in that you need two of these. Simple as that. The reason being is that in Traktor 2.8, at least in the current version of the firmware and so on, you can't do deck A and deck B. You've got to do B and D or A and C, and you can select between those two options quite happily, and then you just hit the deck button to go between it. It's kind of annoying, simply because you can't use it as an A and B controller. So if you want to use this, let's say just as a standalone, you will need your sound card or audio interface as well. But if you just want to use one of these and play a set with that, you've got to basically set your two decks to A and C or B and D. You can't just do A and B and go between the two and switch one layer all night. You've got to have multiple layers, you've got to have decks and switch around. It's just a little bit frustrating from that point of view, and I was really disappointed with that. I tried to do a set with this with CDJs in HID mode and this in the middle, and it was just too frustrating. After about an hour, I just stopped and went back to playing off USB sticks because it just irritated me having to go between shift, A and B, D and B all night. And you could, of course, just use A and C, for example, as your main decks, but then you're going to lose a lot of screen real estate in Traktor. If you've got if you're going to be using your screen as well, you've then got basically your 2 decks on the right hand side over here are basically entirely useless. These 2 would be your main decks, but then if you're using a Z1 or a Z2, you've got to remap all your mixer functions for decks A and C, for example. It's just inelegant is the word I would use, and I'm not a fan of that at all. So much happier to see A and B as a deck selection option. That would make this thing far more practical as an add-on controller, because as it is, you've got to buy 2. That means $500 each, $1,000 for add-on controllers. Now you can see the Control S8 there between the 2 turntables. Now that is kind of pushing the limits of how wide you want to go if you want to use with the DVS and still be able to cut and scratch. And of course we've seen Shifty cutting it up on that, so it is possible. But you'll see when you've got the D2s in place, with a 12-inch mixer, a typical sort of club size, it's pushing the turntables even further out, a few more inches out, and really you are getting kind of beyond the limits there. You can see the plastic feet raising them up to a much nicer level. They still haven't come out with any kind of add-on feet for the S8, so that's nice to see on here. You could of course put them on the outside of your decks, but then the screens are kind of miles away from you. You're kind of losing the real key advantage of the D2, which is that screen. You might as well, in that case, look at your laptop screen if you're going to have them that far away from you. So that is a bit annoying from that point of view. Of course, the main idea for these is to use them as standalone decks, and you can see they look much better in that kind of setup. Now, I've only got one for review, but this is a bit of movie magic. I've got them so you can see 2 side by side, and you can see that's a nice, compact, easy to use setup. So let's talk about layers. Now this is where I think the D2's design is going to put off another kind of batch of DJs that you'd hope would be into it. And that would be kind of Traktor DJs who've really gone for the whole 4 decks syncing, loops and effects kind of playback style, but don't use remix decks. And that's me. I'm not into the whole remix deck thing. I've tried so many different ways of incorporating it into my sets with pre-planned remix decks, pre-built ones, with ones that I've bought, with stuff that I create on the fly from just capturing stuff. None of it works for me at all. I'm much happier with 4 decks in Traktor, just using them like that. And the D2 doesn't really cope very well with that because, for example, we've got the X1 Mark II version here, but the same would apply to the original X1. With these, you can have 2 decks per unit, so I can have one either side of a mixer, and I can, for example, if I've got decks A and C on here, I can start a loop on A and I can end a loop on C at the same time without any issue, or I can end a loop on A and then hit a cue point on C at the same time, and the same would apply across to the other 2 decks. Whereas with the D2, you can't do that. If I want to play this track on deck B and I want to switch over to deck D and get that playing, and now I want to end this loop on D and start a loop at the same time on deck B, there's no way to do it. I mean, I could go really quickly, enter, but it's far less intuitive than it is with just having the full control for 4 decks at once in front of you. So let's take a look at these screens, and they are really, really nice to look at. They're high resolution and so on. You see down at the bottom we've got no track loaded. That's where the overview waveform would be for deck D, and that's where I'm disappointed you can't see deck A and B at the same time. You can only see the 2 on either side. The browsing is really nice. Everything's clean and crisp and great. You can sort all your columns once you're into a playlist, so you can sort by whatever you want. You can choose ascending or descending order as well. Now, unfortunately, you can't choose which fields go on there, so that's key on there rather than my key text that I use for mixed in key, and that would be nice to have an option to actually choose what's sent there. But as you can see, using it with remix decks, so much better even than a Control F1, which has more pads, but with this you can see exactly what is in each slot, and it's still not quite enough to convert me to the idea of remix decks. But if you are a remix deck user, it's just wonderful. You've got your quantizing, you can adjust your filter, your pitch and everything else, and your effect sends for each of your remix deck channels and remix deck slots. It's a really, really smooth experience, and it's just so nice to work with compared to anything else out there that's available right now. So let's wrap this up then. The Control D2. I don't want to come across as negative on this because the hardware itself is fantastic. The ideas are great. The implementation of those ideas is really great also. If you are the kind of person who this workflow appeals to and who that's going to work for, you're going to love this bit of kit. You're going to love the D2. Absolutely you are. I just worry that there aren't enough of that kind of DJ out there to really make this thing a hit. I think it's a little bit too niche from that point of view. I don't think if you've adopted this whole Native Instruments future of DJing remix decks and all that kind of stuff, then yeah, absolutely. But I don't think a lot of people have. I certainly haven't, and I'm a big Traktor user. Remix decks just don't work for me, unfortunately. As an add-on controller for a DVS setup or an HID setup, it's a little bit clunky. You know, the fact that you do need a pair of them, that's the $1,000 we're talking about there. And then your positioning is gonna probably impact on the way that you use them. If you put them to the outside of your decks, you're not gonna see the screens properly and so on. It's a little bit compromised. If you use them as a standalone deck, yeah, they're gonna work really well, but you are gonna need an expensive mixer with an interface built in, or you're going to need a decent interface to go with it, 4 channels and so on. It makes the actual S8 look far more attractive, really, because this is only $1,200, so $200 more than a pair of these, and you've got the 4-channel mixer. The interface is all built in there as well. So if you are looking at the D2s, I would suggest you look seriously at the S8, because you might find that's a better value proposition. I might be wrong. There might be thousands and thousands of DJs out there for whom this is the perfect workflow. And if so, do let us know in the comments if that's you. I'd be interested to hear. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe for all our future tips, tricks, and product reviews. I'll see you soon.